You would bend over backward, and they called that love. But what was love? I would never hurt you like that. You were saying yes when you wanted to scream no. You swallowed tears just to maintain a presence that never truly saw you. You dimmed your light, so as not to blind those who never had the courage to look you in the eyes. Rumi said, "You were born with wings. Why do you prefer to crawl through life?" And maybe no one told you, but every time you gave in, you distanced yourself a little further from yourself. You didn't want attention, you wanted connection, but you confused love with survival. And when the soul enters this survival mode, it learns to smile on the outside and bleed on the inside. She convinces herself that this is better than nothing. She accepts crumbs because she has forgotten the taste of emotional abundance. Have you experienced this? Have you ever felt like you were always trying, always giving in? And yet, was it never enough? Perhaps you've done everything you can. If molded, it was soaked. If broken, and even so, it was abandoned, forgotten, ignored. Because nobody teaches you what true love is. It does not require sacrifice of the soul. Nobody explains to you that when you need to lose yourself in order to keep someone, you're already alone. The burning truth is this: you weren't loved for who you are. You were used for how well you could bend the rules. But something happened. One night, one silence, one moment of utter exhaustion, and you stopped. He stopped trying to be what they expected. He stopped making excuses. It stopped bending over, and it was there. Exactly there. That's when everything started to change. Not because the world has changed, but why did you remember who you were before learning how to turn off? Because when the soul refuses to bend again, she wakes up. And that's what we're going to talk about today. About the sacred moment when you stop begging for love and begins to reconnect with her truth. If this has touched something inside you, stay, breathe, feel. This video is a mirror, and perhaps for the first time, you will see yourself in your entirety. So before we continue, take a deep breath, because what comes next, it's not easy to listen to, but it might be exactly what your soul needs. If any part of this beginning has already spoken to you, comment below. I stopped bending over backwards. This simple gesture can be the beginning of your liberation, and it can also touch other souls that are still silent. Leave a like, if that makes sense to you. Subscribe, because here, each video is a whisper from the soul, a key to its reconstruction. You are not alone, and the next step could be what changes everything. Let's continue, because now let's talk about the invisible problem that makes you bend without realizing it. You gave of yourself. You adjusted. You remained silent. But in the end, you were still being left out. You didn't do that because you were weak. Quite the opposite. You did it because somewhere in your history you learned that to love meant to erase yourself. She learned that being seen required effort, that to be chosen, one had to deserve it. So you always tried to be the best version of yourself, the most understanding, the one who doesn't complain, the one who understands, welcomes, forgives. You were making yourself small to keep close someone who had already shown you, with every gesture, that they never wanted to stay. And maybe no one has told you this, but it's exhausting. It's not physical tiredness. It's an exhaustion of the soul. It's the burden of constantly trying to be enough, when in reality, you always were, but he never saw it. And the most painful part? Did you know that? I knew he didn't see it, that he didn't value it, but she persisted, because hope made her believe that one day, maybe, he would understand. But he didn't understand. And when he left, he took with him the part of you that believed love could heal everything. But it didn't heal, because it wasn't love. It was neediness, disguised as surrender. Have you ever felt like you were fading into the background so that someone else could shine? Why did she remain silent so as not to seem too intense? Who smiled with tears in their eyes just so as not to scare away those who lacked the depth to understand you? Have you ever been afraid of being too much? Is it about speaking your feelings and ending up sounding needy, even when you're just being honest? Have you ever pretended to be okay just to avoid seeming fragile? Have you ever put on a strong mask when in reality, what you wanted most was to be embraced? Perhaps you've done this so many times that you've come to believe this is your role, to be the one who waits, the one who understands, the one who accepts less than she deserves. And when you look back, You realize that you've lived like that for years, with a full heart and an empty soul, offering the best of yourself to someone who only gave you the bare minimum, requesting attendance but receiving justified absences, begging for affection in unanswered messages, trying to understand the silence as if it were an enigma, when in reality, it was just disinterest. But how can I say that without feeling guilty? You wondered, am I demanding too much? Am I difficult to love? And that's where the pain hides, in the space between what you feel and what you believe you deserve. Because somewhere along the line, you internalize the idea that love is sacrifice. If it doesn't hurt, it's not real. And if he leaves, the problem is you. You believe it, but at the same time, a part of you is screaming. A part of you got tired. He's tired of being a stage for other people's emotional vanity. He grew tired of giving his soul to those who only wanted distraction. She grew tired of being strong just to keep weak people around. And that part that screams now is your truth. It's the voice you've stifled for years, but which insists on returning. It is the call that says, enough. Because you weren't born to live life halfway. It wasn't born to be an option. It wasn't born to bend. That pain you feel, that silent discomfort that insists on visiting you at night, is not just loneliness. It's nostalgia for herself. I miss the woman you were before you were shaped by absences and rejections, before trying to fit into the mold of a love that only existed in her expectations. Perhaps you've never said this out loud, but deep down you know. You gave too much to those who didn't know how to receive it, and not because he was incapable, but because it was never his role to fill that void for you. You gave so much, and he only received. You adjusted yourself, and he never moved an inch to meet you halfway. You were silent, and he didn't even notice the noise of your silence. And you know what's the cruelest thing about all this? It's just that even after everything, you still blame yourself. He still carries the responsibility of not having been enough, when in reality, the problem was never how much you offered. That was how incapable he was of appreciating things. That pain you feel, that feeling of emptiness. She is not weak. She is proof that you are still alive, that there is still something inside you that wants to be respected, recognized, and truly loved. Not in parts, not under any circumstances, but completely. And that's why you're here, because it can no longer bear to bend over. She can no longer tolerate this role of savior, of emotional caregiver for others, while no one takes care of her. You want more, you need more, and deep down, she knows she deserves more. So if this video is affecting you, if at any point you've seen yourself in this mirror I'm holding, comment below. This pain has a name, and so do I. You don't need to explain anything else, just write. Because sometimes healing begins exactly like that, with a small truth being spoken aloud. You weren't being kind. You were unconsciously begging to be seen. That's the truth that hurts the most. The one no one tells us, but that the body feels, that the soul screams in silence. What outwardly seemed like love, devotion, empathy, inside, was despair. The despair of someone who spent too much time invisible. Of someone who learned very early on that they needed to deserve even the bare minimum. You smiled, you welcomed, you yielded. But inside you were always asking, see me, notice me, choose me, consider me. And it wasn't just about him. It was about everything. About the childhood that taught you to be silent so you wouldn't be rejected. About the environment where feeling was wrong, where expressing pain was weakness, where wanting too much was being dramatic. So you learned to mold yourself, to observe before speaking, to guess what the other person needed so as not to bother them with your own needs. And this pattern grew with you. It entered your relationships. It invaded your friendships. It became a habit. And the worst part, it became your identity. You came to believe that you would only be loved if you were easy, if you were strong, if you were perfect. But Rumi said, that which you seek also seeks you. But you need to stop running from yourself. And perhaps what you are seeking is not another relationship. Perhaps what you are seeking is a reunion with the woman you were before you bent over so many times to fit into someone else's world. Perhaps you have been running from yourself for years, because being with yourself hurts. It hurts because the silence reveals. It hurts because solitude shows everything you have strived to hide. But it is in this silence that the soul awakens. The root of your pain isn't in the person who left you. It's in how much you abandoned yourself trying to be loved. And this kind of abandonment is the cruelest, because it comes from within. You put yourself last. You forgot yourself to remember the other person. You faded away, believing that this would make you shine in someone else's eyes. And this constant attempt at external validation disconnected you from everything sacred within you. You stopped listening to your intuition. You stopped honoring your boundaries. You stopped trusting your own voice. It's not that you chose to suffer. It's that no one taught you another way. No one showed you that love doesn't need proof, that affection doesn't require sacrifice, that reciprocity isn't a favor, it's fundamental. And now perhaps for the first time you're beginning to see. You're realizing that behind all these recurring stories, there's an invisible pattern, an emotional cycle that keeps you stuck in the same place, giving too much, receiving too little, waiting for changes that never come, justifying absences, accepting crumbs. You think you're in love, but you're just surviving. And that needs to be said bravely, because continuing to live like this isn't fair to you. You deserve more than relationships where you have to bend over backwards to be tolerated. You deserve more than sporadic attention, more than empty promises, more than an absent presence. You deserve depth. You deserve soul connection. You deserve to be chosen without having to beg for it. But as long as you run away from yourself, you will continue to attract people who are also running away. People who don't know how to surrender. People who don't know how to stay. People who only know how to take, but don't know how to give. Because what you accept from others is a reflection of what you believe about yourself. And if you still accept less, it's because you still haven't understood your own worth. The hardest part of this spiritual awakening journey isn't letting the other person go. It's finding yourself after they've left. It's dealing with the emptiness, with the echo of unanswered questions, with the versions of yourself that were created solely to please others. But it's there, at that exact breaking point, that healing begins. When you look at yourself honestly and say, enough. I will no longer abandon myself to be loved. I will no longer betray my essence to fit into a shallow relationship. The root of the pain is spiritual. It's disconnection. It's estrangement from oneself. And every attempt to seek in another what is lacking within only deepens this void. It only increases loneliness. Because no one can give you what you are not willing to offer yourself. No man, no relationship, no affection will fill the emptiness of a soul that has abandoned itself. Yes, it hurts. Because acknowledging this is like tearing open an old wound you've spent years trying to hide. But this pain is sacred, because it's taking you back home. It's making you remember who you were before the fear, before the neediness, before the need to be accepted. And this reunion, however painful it may be, is what will set you free. Now, if you've made it this far and feel something stirring inside you, if you feel this text has read you from the inside, comment below. I'm coming back to myself. That's all. One sentence, one commitment, a first step back. Because when you stop running away from yourself, everything starts to align. And what once seemed distant finally begins to get closer. What no one told you is that you weren't rejected for being too much. It was never about intensity, about giving yourself deeply, about feeling with your heart wide open. The truth is different, more subtle, more silent, and harder to accept. You were rejected the exact moment you began to abandon yourself to please others. You were rejected because in trying to fit into someone else's world, you forgot your own. You forgot who you were. You forgot the strength within you. You forgot your light and your center. You forgot that your soul was never meant to live chained to small expectations. You began to bend slightly. A concession here, a renunciation there. At first it seemed like love. It seemed like care. But little by little, it became a prison. And when you realized it, you no longer knew where the other person ended and you began. You were fused with an idea of love that seemed more like penance. And do you know the cruelest detail of all this? You came to believe that this was normal, that it was just how it was, that loving required disappearance, that to keep someone close it was necessary to give up yourself. But love isn't like that. Love doesn't demand that you diminish yourself. True love doesn't require sacrificing your essence. Love isn't a silent contract where only one person gives while the other only receives. Love isn't this emotional tightrope you try to balance alone. You were taught to mold yourself, to bend, to please. And while you were doing that, you thought you were loving. But in reality, you were trying not to be left. You were striving to be enough, even if to do so, you had to disappear. But there's a limit, a saturation point, a day when the weariness of the soul becomes greater than the fear of losing. And it's on that day that everything changes. Because it's in that instant that you realize the real loss wasn't him. It was you. You lost yourself trying to hold on to someone. You lost yourself trying to maintain a story that was never reciprocated. You lost yourself, and that hurt more than any absence. Because nothing hurts more than abandoning yourself. And this is where the key comes in. The spiritual key. The silent key. The key that no one gave you because most people still live locked outside themselves. This key has a name. Authenticity. And it only appears when you decide to stop bending. When you remember who you are. When you honor your pain not as weakness but as a portal. Because your pain, however sharp it may be, is trying to tell you something. It didn't come to destroy you. It came to awaken you. To stop bending over backward is an act of rebirth. It's a gesture of courage. It's a return to your emotional dignity. You no longer need to fit into spaces that diminish your soul. You no longer need to fight for one-sided connections. You no longer need to wait to be noticed by those who live distracted. You don't need to beg for reciprocity. Love isn't begged for. Love is shared. Love doesn't force you to prove your worth. Love recognizes. Love welcomes. Love finds you exactly where you are whole. And perhaps you're feeling afraid right now. Afraid of change. Afraid of loss. Afraid of being alone. But this fear is natural. It only exists because your soul is returning home, and everything that is true is frightening at first. You've spent so much time trying to fit in that now even freedom seems uncomfortable. But this is the transition. This is the portal. And on the other side of it lies something you don't yet know, but have always sought. Peace. Yes, peace. Not that superficial peace that comes from silencing pain, but the peace that is born when you live in truth with who you are. When you no longer need to lie, or be silent, or pretend. When there is no more effort in being. When you can finally breathe. The key is to stop trying to control what doesn't belong to you. To let go of what was never reciprocated. To say no to what weakens your soul. To not apologize for being intense, sensitive, profound. You don't need to be less to be loved. You just need to be yourself. You need to be at peace with the idea that not everyone will know how to handle your depth. And that's okay. Not everyone has the breath to swim where you dive. But whoever does, will stay. They will arrive. They will recognize you. And they won't ask you to bend over backwards. They will look at you and say, "You can be whole, I can handle it." And you will realize that real love doesn't shout, doesn't pressure, doesn't demand. It simply embraces. Perhaps this is your time to turn the page. To do things differently. To choose for yourself. To stop putting yourself last. To no longer wait to be the choice of someone who doesn't even know how to choose themselves. Perhaps this is your time to stop running from the mirror. To stop running from the silence. To stop running from your own presence. The truth is, the more you distance yourself from who you are, the more you attract people who are also distant from themselves. And now that you know this, now that something inside you recognizes this truth, you can no longer ignore yourself. You can no longer betray yourself. You can no longer fit into a place where your soul feels claustrophobic. The key has been given to you, and it's in your hands. What you do with it is your choice. If you've made it this far and feel that this key has unlocked something within you, comment below. I chose to stop bending over backward. Write this as a reminder, as a silent vow with your soul, as a commitment to your truth. Because sometimes, all we need is to declare, even in just a few words, that we will no longer return to the place where we got lost. Perhaps you've lived through this. Perhaps you're still living it. That story disguised as love, but which deep down always had more absence than presence. He only sought you out when he needed something, when his world crumbled, when loneliness weighed heavily, when it was convenient. And you, with an open heart and eyes full of hope, always said, "It's okay," even when it wasn't okay. Even when your chest ached and your soul cried out for a little reciprocity. You said it's okay not because you accepted little, but because you were afraid of losing even that little. Because deep down, you believed that if you showed your pain, he would leave. So you kept quiet. You swallowed your tears, disguised your disappointment, masked his silences with understanding. You adapted to each absence as if it were your obligation to be understanding. as if it were wrong to ask for his presence, as if asking to be truly loved was too much. You became a refuge for a man who didn't even know how to stay. You became comfort, counselor, companion, always available, always ready, always waiting for him to finally see how much you were there, how much you were trying, how much you were giving of yourself. But he didn't see it, because he was used to the ease, to your automatic surrender, to your wide-open soul. And then, one day, you got tired. It wasn't sudden. It happened slowly, like a candle slowly going out, without fanfare. You didn't make a scene, you didn't demand anything, you didn't shout. You just remained silent. A different kind of silence. A silence that said more than any outburst. A silence that didn't beg, that didn't expect an answer, that didn't ask for an explanation. A silence that finally looked at yourself and said, enough. It was in that silence that something began to change. At first, there was pain, that raw pain of feeling abandoned even by oneself. But then came clarity. You realized that in truth you had been alone for a long time, that he hadn't been there for a long time even though he was physically close, that what kept you trapped wasn't love, it was attachment. It was the fear of facing the mirror of loneliness. But now in the silence you began to rediscover yourself. You rediscovered your voice, the one you silenced to avoid conflict. You rediscovered your boundaries, the ones you ignored just to avoid pushing them away. You rediscovered your body, the one you offered hoping for affection and received only empty presence. And more than anything, you rediscovered your soul, the one that screamed silently, begging for rescue, and which now finally was being heard by you. You began to remember what you liked, what you dreamed of, what you deserved. You started to realize that the peace you sought outside had always been within, that the answer you expected from him would never come, because he lacked the capacity to access the depth where you dwell. And this, instead of destroying you, freed you, because you understood that his absence was merely the necessary space for your presence to flourish. You no longer needed proof. You no longer needed explanations, because you finally realized that when love demands forced silence, when presence is intermittent, when you need to hide to keep someone, it's not love. It's emotional imprisonment disguised as an affectionate bond. And the key to that prison was in your hands all along. That's when you started to stand up, without making a sound, without seeking revenge, without justifying yourself. You simply stood up, and each step you took away from that pattern was a reunion with something sacred, something that was dormant, but never dead. Your self-esteem, your integrity, your emotional dignity, everything you buried trying to keep alive a bond that was never reciprocated. With each unanswered message, you learned to answer yourself. With each ignored call, you learned to listen to yourself. With each broken promise, you made a new one, never to lose yourself for anyone again. And this promise wasn't made in anger but with firmness, with the serenity of someone who understood that true love doesn't need to be begged for, that whoever truly loves you, stays, chooses you, cares for you, and above all, sees you. This is the silent turning point that so many women experience. That moment when neediness transforms into awareness, when the love you offered to others begins to return within. And when that happens, you stop being a prisoner of absence. You stop feeding on illusions. You reconnect with the only thing you should never have left behind, your essence. And perhaps you're still in that process. Perhaps there are still days when the silence weighs heavily, when the memory hurts, when doubt creeps in. But now you know. You know you're no longer lost. You know you no longer need to bend over backwards to fit in. You know your soul has wings, and that it was never meant to live crawling for emotional crumbs. If this text resonated with your story, if you recognized your steps in each line, comment below. In silence, I rediscovered myself. Say this as an affirmation, as liberation, as part of your healing process. Because sometimes all the soul needs is to hear from itself that it is returning home. You didn't lose anything, even if it felt like a loss, even if it hurt as if something had been ripped from inside you, even if you cried for nights on end, feeling like the ground was disappearing beneath your feet, even if your mind, for days or weeks, tried to find answers, justifications, explanations, the truth, which may now be slowly revealing itself. is that you simply stopped fighting for crumbs. You simply let go of what, deep down, no longer nourished you, even if your heart still resisted accepting it. The turning point wasn't external. It was internal. The change didn't happen because he did something different. It happened because you got tired, not of the other person, but of yourself trying to adapt to spaces that were never meant for you. Trying to be enough for someone who never had the depth to see beyond the surface. Trying to sustain alone what should have been built together. Trying to keep alive a fire that only you could fuel. Rumi whispers, when you stop chasing, that's when everything starts coming to you. And perhaps for the first time, you are beginning to understand this truth. You no longer need to chase. You no longer need to insist. You no longer need to prove that you are worthy. Because you already are. You always have been. You just didn't see it. Because you were too busy trying to win the love of someone who didn't even know what love was. And now, with eyes clearer from the tears, with a heart stronger after the falls, you begin to realize you haven't lost anything. You've freed yourself. You freed yourself from the need to be chosen. You freed yourself from the addiction to waiting. You freed yourself from the illusion that the other person had something that completed you. You freed yourself from the emotional dependence that disguised insecurity about affection. Because deep down, what you were looking for in him was just a reflection of what you had forgotten to give yourself. This is the turning point in consciousness. It's when the emptiness no longer scares you because you understood that what was killing you wasn't loneliness. It was the absence of yourself. You spent so much time trying to be the best for others that you forgot to be whole for yourself. And now, by stopping the chase, everything begins to change. Not like magic, but as truth. Because the universe responds to your inner state. And when you vibrate surrender, you attract more surrender. But when you vibrate presence, when you return to yourself, everything begins to realign. It's not about arrogance. It's not about pride. It's about emotional dignity. It's about looking in the mirror and saying, I don't accept less than I deserve. It's about knowing your worth, not as a defense mechanism, but as a matter of conscience. Because when you know who you are, when you recognize your depth, your soul is no longer interested in shallow relationships. It's not attracted to empty promises. It doesn't feed on lukewarm gestures. Your soul wants truth, presence, wholeness. And that's only possible when you are whole. And perhaps you are feeling this transition now. Perhaps there are still remnants of fear, insecurity, and doubt. That's normal. Your mind will try to pull you back. It will tell you that you should try again. That maybe, if you insist a little more, he will change. But now you know. You know that what changed wasn't him. It was you. And that this change is irreversible. Because once you find yourself again, there's no way to get lost again. You start to see the signs. The ones you used to ignore. The lame excuses, the absences disguised as freedom, the lack of reciprocity you called differences in the language of love. Now all of that has a name, it has form, it has weight, and you no longer carry it alone. This turning point also brings pain, because it demands that you shed all the versions you've created to survive, but at the same time it brings lightness, because you can finally be yourself, without needing to edit your essence. Without needing to calculate your words, without walking on eggshells, without suppressing feelings. The freedom to be whole is the greatest gift that consciousness can give you. And with that freedom comes clarity about what you accept and what you no longer accept. You stop negotiating the non-negotiable. You stop putting commas where life has already placed a period. You stop expecting the other person to become someone they are not ready to be. You stop. And by stopping, you align yourself. With yourself, with time, with life, with the flow. And then, what once seemed essential reveals itself as illusion. What once seemed like love reveals itself as neediness. What once seemed like loss reveals itself as liberation. Because the soul knows. It always knew. But it was patient. It waited for the right moment. And now, that moment has arrived. The moment to never return to the place where you got lost. If you feel you are experiencing this silent turning point, if you realize that what seemed like an end was actually a disguised beginning, comment below. My consciousness has awakened. No need to explain. Just write. Because this phrase is more than words. It's a milestone, a declaration, a firm step on the path back to your truth. You thought yielding was love, that taking a step back was maturity. that silently accepting what hurt you was proof of wisdom. You confused tolerance with love, and you confused love with survival. Because deep down you weren't yielding out of greatness of soul, you were yielding out of fear. Fear of being left, fear of being replaced, fear of being seen as too difficult. So you stopped being that. You lowered your tone, moderated your gestures, softened the pain. You thought, if I'm easy to deal with, he won't leave. If I don't cause conflict, he'll stay. But he didn't stay. And if he did, it was only in body because his soul had already left long ago. You thought you were building love, but you were only avoiding abandonment. You projected your neediness onto the guise of surrender. And it's hard to say that. It hurts to admit, because it requires a deep dive into the root of what moves you. But that's the truth that hurts. The truth that opens up. The truth that, when accepted, heals. You weren't loving freely. You were begging for belonging with gentle gestures, with measured words, with complicit silence. You thought that if you gave up a little more of yourself, he would notice. That if you swallowed another grudge, he would change. That if you smiled during another moment of absence, he would wake up. But he didn't wake up, because people who only receive rarely notice when the other person starts to disappear. And you, little by little, disappeared from yourself. And each time you bent down to maintain it, your spirit retreated. Each time you accepted less than you deserved, the universe understood that this was what you believed you deserved. Each time you stopped being who you are to be who he needed, you distanced yourself from your own essence. The healing came when you understood, when something inside you, exhausted from trying, finally surrendered. Surrendered not in the sense of giving up, but in the sense of accepting the truth. The truth that love, when it's real, doesn't demand sacrifice of the soul. The truth that you don't need to change yourself to fit into anyone's life. The truth that whoever loves you doesn't demand that you bend. On the contrary, whoever loves you wants you standing, wants you whole, wants you with boundaries, with a voice, with presence, wants you exactly as you are, and not as a malleable project of emotional convenience. And in that understanding, a wound healed, not with indifference but with maturity. You began to look back not with resentment but with clarity. You began to see that all the giving in too much were in fact signs that you didn't believe in your own worth. You began to realize that every time you said yes with a bleeding heart, you were signing a silent contract with your own self-betrayal. But that version of you is fading away. The one that begged for crumbs no longer dictates your steps. Now you are guided by a new consciousness, more serene, clearer, deeper. A consciousness that tells you firmly and sweetly, I will no longer bend. I can be flexible, yes. I can be empathetic. I can understand the cycles and the silences, but I will no longer bow to disrespect. I will not diminish myself to be loved. I will not silence truths to keep others comfortable. This awareness is the beginning of everything. It's the seed of a new love. A love that begins within, that blossoms with respect, that matures with presence. And this love will change the way you relate to everything, to people, to desires, to boundaries. Because when you love yourself deeply, you no longer tolerate the superficiality of those who don't have the courage to dive in with you. You stop accepting flimsy excuses. You stop romanticizing absence. You stop trying to save the other person from their own emotional immaturity. You understand that it's not your role to teach the basics: presence, care, respect. You understand that the love you offer can only be received by someone who has the strength to sustain that love. Because deep love requires courage. And you can no longer offer your heart as if it were a test. As if with each offering you need to wait to see if the other person will stay. Now, you stay. For yourself. Now, you choose yourself. Now you look at yourself with the tenderness you once expected from him. Now you learn to listen to the silence without despair, because you understand that your value is not in the other person's response, but in fidelity to your soul. Now, you walk with firmness. Not because everything is resolved, but because you have stopped betraying yourself. This is liberation, not an escape, but an encounter with your truth, with your voice, with your capacity to feel everything you feel without needing to hide. Now you know that your intensity is not excessive, that your depth is not a flaw, that your way of loving is not an exaggeration. It is strength, it is beauty, it is presence. If this truth burned within you, if you saw yourself in these words as if looking in a clean mirror after a long time, comment below, love doesn't demand that I bend. Leave these words recorded as a reminder of the point at which your healing became non-negotiable, because sometimes liberation begins like this, with a phrase that echoes inside and never goes away. Now, you walk fully, and that is so new, so strange, so liberating. There is no longer the burden of pleasing, no longer the need to justify your presence, your emotions, your silences. You have become a presence in your own right. You walk without making a sound, but wherever you go, something changes. Your energy has changed. Your emotional field has reorganized itself. You no longer beg. You no longer bow down. You no longer hide. There is a new firmness in your walk, a firmness that doesn't shout, but sustains, a strength that doesn't threaten, but radiates. Even your absence is felt now, because when you disappear, the emptiness is real. Before you erased yourself and no one noticed. Now when you withdraw, the silence speaks. It speaks clearly. It speaks with impact, because those who were used to your constant, gratuitous, predictable presence now feel the absence like an echo. But that no longer nourishes you. You no longer need the pain of others as confirmation that you are important. You no longer need them to miss you to validate your presence. You are at peace with who you are. And that is the hardest peace to achieve. The peace of no longer needing to prove anything. This is a silent rebirth, a new emotional state, a place where there is no urgency, no despair, no longer that constant anxiety of being enough. Now you know that you already are. You know you don't need to adapt to anyone to be worthy. You know you don't need to diminish your intensity to fit into small loves. You stopped trying to be understood by those who still live in shallowness. You accepted that not everyone will understand you. And that's okay, because you understood yourself. And that's enough. This new state didn't come easily. It was built from ruins, from tears, from unanswered silences, from "it's okay" said with a lump in your throat. You rebuilt your identity in the dark, in absence, in pain. But now you look back and recognize each fall was a preparation. Each abandonment was an invitation to return. Each disappointment was a revelation. Nothing was in vain. Nothing. And now everything you do carries this new awareness. From the way you dress to how you conduct yourself in conversations, you no longer swallow words for fear of losing. You no longer say yes when your whole body screams no. You are no longer attracted by promises. You observe actions. You feel the vibration behind the words. You are no longer charmed by those who speak beautifully, but by those who take a stand with truth. You started listening to yourself. You started respecting yourself. You started honoring the time it took to get here. And that's why you're no longer in a hurry. You know that what is yours doesn't require forced effort. You know that what is true has time, rhythm, depth, and you learned to wait, but no longer that anxious, desperate waiting, conditioned by the other. Now it's a waiting of someone who knows they deserve it, a waiting of someone who is no longer in a hurry to lose themselves for anyone. This rebirth doesn't need to be understood by everyone. Sometimes it will even be unsettling. It will seem like coldness to those who only recognized you for your excessive giving. It will seem like arrogance to those who only accepted you when you were begging. But you are no longer the one who begs. You are the one who chooses. And your absence now also has a presence. Because you have ceased to be accessible to those who don't know how to delve deeper. You have ceased to be emotionally available to those who only appeared when it was convenient. Now you ask different questions. Instead of, "Does he like me?" you ask, "Does he even see me?" Instead of, "How can I be more relaxed?" you ask, "Am I being true to myself?" Instead of, "Will he come back?" you say, "I've rediscovered myself, and that's all." You've stopped living waiting for external answers. Now, you listen to the internal answers, and they have been clear, even when painful. This new emotional state is silent yet overwhelming. You no longer need to assert yourself. Your presence speaks for you. Your eyes speak. Your silence speaks. You stopped speaking where you weren't heard. You stopped explaining yourself to those who didn't want to understand. You stopped reopening wounds for those who didn't even have hands to hold your pain. And so now, you blossom, calmly, consciously, deeply. And each petal that opens also opens a new chapter of your soul. Perhaps no one notices how much you've changed. Perhaps no one sees the revolution happening inside you. But you know. And that's enough. You feel that something that once held you back no longer has power. You feel that the need to please is a thing of the past, that the rush to be loved has dissolved, that the urgency to be chosen has transformed into the decision to choose yourself every day, firmly, tenderly, respectfully. If you felt something inside you reborn lately, even if no one else has noticed, comment below. I've become myself again. May this phrase symbolize your new beginning, mark your presence, remind you that your worth no longer depends on the recognition of others. Because when you become yourself again, the whole world starts to see you differently. Have you ever erased yourself for love? Have you ever pretended to be okay just so as not to scare someone with your pain? Have you ever preferred to remain silent, even with your heart screaming, because you felt that if you showed too much, they would feel less for you? Have you ever been afraid to be intense, to be sincere, to be completely yourself because you believed that this would be too much for the other person? Perhaps you learned early on that love requires effort, that it needs to earn attention, deserve affection, deserve presence, and you grew up believing that to keep someone close it would be necessary to erase parts of yourself, to be lighter, sweeter, more understanding, to be less demanding, less emotional, less profound. You learned to shrink yourself to fit into the small versions of love that life offered you. But the truth is that this silent erasure is not love. It's self-denial. It's emotional abandonment. It's a wound being reopened every day. Because every time you hide to be accepted, you internally confirm the false belief that your essence is a problem, that your intensity is a threat, that your love needs to be carefully managed, as if it were an excess. But the soul wasn't made to live extinguished. When the soul is suffocated for too long, it begins to sicken. It begins to truly fall silent. It begins to give up. And perhaps you are exactly at that point, where silence is no longer a choice but exhaustion, where withdrawal is no longer protection, but anesthesia, where emptiness is no longer a sign of freedom, but a symptom of someone who has lived so much for others that they have forgotten what it was like to live for themselves. And this is where reflection needs to begin. Because if you're listening to this now, if you've reached this point in the video, if you haven't completely given up on yourself yet, it's because something inside you wants to awaken. Something inside you still pulsates, still feels, still hopes to be rediscovered. And it's to this something that I want to speak now. Do you remember who you were before you started fading away for love? Before silencing your truth to maintain a presence? Before carrying alone relationships that only existed because you went to great lengths to keep them alive? Do you remember your strength, your voice, your clarity, the sparkle in your eyes that came when you were true to your feelings? Perhaps you think that version of yourself is lost, that it's buried under layers of hurt, frustration, abandonment, and rejection. But it's not dead. It's asleep. It's waiting for your call. Because only you can awaken it. Only you can rescue who you were before you started believing you needed to erase yourself to be loved. And this reconnection doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't come with a snap. It comes with small movements, with small decisions, like the simple act of recognizing that enough is enough, like the silent gesture of stopping bending over backward to maintain something that was never whole, like the exact moment when you choose to stop repeating old cycles and start saying no, even if your voice still trembles. Even if your heart is still afraid. You need to remember that true love doesn't demand that you disappear. Love doesn't extinguish. Love ignites. Love doesn't require molds. Love expands. Love doesn't imprison. Love liberates. And everything that asks you to be less, to hide your soul, to silence your intensity, is not love. It's control. It's disguised fear. It's emotional dependence disguised as a bond. What you're feeling now might be a mixture of pain and clarity, a clarity that hurts, an awakening that disorients. But this is necessary, because all healing begins with the discomfort of looking at what has been avoided for so long. And there is no other way. You will need to go through the pain to come out on the other side. But this time, unlike all the others, you will not abandon yourself in the process. You will choose for yourself. You will prioritize yourself. You will stand up. And it's not because someone finally recognized you. It's because you, for the first time, decided to see yourself. And this simple gesture of seeing yourself is what changes everything. Because no one else will be able to convince you that you need to fade away to be loved. Not after you have tasted your own light. Not after you have felt what it's like to walk whole. So if you felt that calling in your heart, if at any point in those words you recognized yourself, if some part of you whispered, "She's talking about me," comment below. Today I choose to get up. That's all. One sentence. One choice. A silent turning point. Because sometimes the first step towards healing doesn't come from the outside. It comes when you, even hurt, even afraid, decide not to fade away anymore. And that, in itself, is already a new beginning. Rumi said, "The wound is where the light enters you, but only when you stop bending over does the light have room to enter. If you've made it this far, to this very moment, it's because your soul is ready. Ready to stop crawling for love. Ready to stop erasing herself in order to be accepted. Ready to remember that she was born with wings. And I want to tell you, you are not alone. Leave a like. But truth was felt in every word. Subscribe to the channel because here, each video is a soul-to-soul delivery, and your healing journey is only just beginning. And if you felt that this was intense, watch the next video that is now appearing on the screen. He will take you even deeper on this path of rediscovering who you truly are. You stayed until the end. That says a lot about your courage. Now, breathe, and keep going, because its light is only beginning to be born.